Hello, I'm taking on a challenge to beat every playable Nintendo-published video game. The next game is Super Mario Land. Well, we've finally done it. We've made it to a new Nintendo console. It only took a little under 200 games to actually reach the Game Boy. With the Japanese release, Nintendo had 4 different titles prepared for the system's launch: Super Mario Land, Alleyway, Baseball, and Yakuman. While I could have started with any of these, it only made sense for me to start with none other than Nintendo's iconic plumber. That's right, the first game we're taking a look at on the Game Boy is Super Mario Land. However, before diving into the history of the game itself, let's take a look at who at Nintendo actually made the Game Boy and what its development was like. In order to understand who was behind the Game Boy project, let me reintroduce 2 long-standing veterans of Nintendo's early years as game designers, Gunpei Yokoi and Satoru Okada. Now, both of these guys have shown up numerous times in the challenge before, but in case you haven't heard of them, let's do a quick recap. These 2 were both Nintendo employees that have been around since before Nintendo even started making video games. Yokoi designed many of Nintendo's earliest toys, and his ingenuity earned him a spot at the head of Nintendo's research and development team. Okada worked under Yokoi during this time to help with the electronic side of things, and he even contributed to some of Nintendo's early light gun efforts. Eventually, after R&D split into 2 teams, Nintendo R&D 1 consisted of just Yokoi and Okada, and together they created the Game & Watch. This turned out to be a successful endeavor for Nintendo, but it eventually became overshadowed by Nintendo R&D 2's creation, the Famicom. Apparently, both Okada and Yokoi had ideas for making something akin to a portable Famicom, but they each had drastically different ways they wanted to approach the project. Yokoi wanted something more similar to the Game & Watch, something cheap that could be made quickly that supported games that were fast and easy to develop. However, Okada did not think this would work. He thought Yokoi's ideas wouldn't last in the long term, and Okada wanted the device to be more ambitious and more like the Famicom than the Game & Watch. Okada's proposal was to spend a few years developing the machine rather than just trying to pump something out quickly. Apparently, Yokoi and Okada got into many heated arguments over this device. However, it was Okada's reasoning that won over Yamauchi, Nintendo's president, in the end. Thus, Okada made the project his own, and he has even claimed that Yokoi's involvement was more of a stamp of approval role rather than a designing one, although as we'll soon see, Yokoi was still pretty heavily invested in the Game Boy too. One of the big aspects of designing this console was what to do with the screen. Early on, they knew they wanted to use dot matrix technology similar to the Game & Watch, although they realized it would need to be more advanced to support many different kinds of games. They worked on this screen technology with Sharp, the calculator manufacturers who helped Nintendo create the Game & Watch. However, they were not the only company Nintendo talked with. Nintendo shopped around to look for something cheaper, and apparently Sharp and another technology company called Citizen started to compete pretty heavily to win Nintendo over. After lowering their prices, it was Sharp that won out in the end and created the screens for the Game Boy. The reason for the monochrome color, according to Yokoi, was simply that the benefits of adding color did not outweigh the cost and battery performance. In Yokoi's mind, you don't need color to convey an idea, and as long as people were drawn into the games, the color was not important. The technology to make color screens existed, but Yokoi didn't think it was worth it, saying that hardware design isn't just about making the most powerful thing you can. Apparently, the first screen they showed Yamauchi used some kind of technology called Twisted Pneumatic, and Yamauchi was not impressed. So much so that he said that they could not even sell the Game Boy if it had a screen that looked that bad. These prototype screens were the same ones they used for the Game & Watch, and according to Yokoi, you had to hold the device at a particular angle to see them well. Yokoi had apparently ordered a ton of these screens from Sharp already, and he hadn't realized just how bad they looked when held at the angle people naturally held a Game Boy. It was such a costly mistake that Yokoi described it as the biggest mistake of his life. He was worried this would tank his reputation, and he worked tirelessly on a solution. He worked so hard that he started skipping meals to the point where a blood test revealed that he was extremely malnourished. Yokoi worked with Sharp to get a newer screen technology called Super Twisted Pneumatic to work with the Game Boy. The contrast was now better, but it was a bit slow, and it took some time before they finally had another working prototype. Once they showed this new screen to Yamauchi, he simply said, "Oh, this should work fine," and Yokoi was deflated as he realized Yamauchi wasn't nearly as worried about the prototype as he was. Apparently, this Super Twisted Pneumatic display is also why the Game Boy screen has a green tint. Due to some complicated reasons I can't understand involving the rotation of liquid crystal molecules, Super Twisted Pneumatic screens will show a certain color, and it's usually either a yellowish green or a blue. The CPU of the Game Boy was also made by Sharp, although that wasn't the initial plan. At first, R&D 1 wanted to have cross-compatibility with the Famicom, so they considered using a CPU made by Ricoh, the same company that made the Famicom CPU. However, Uemura, the leader of R&D 2 and creator of the Famicom, told them not to. Uemura said that his team was busy working with Ricoh on the Super Famicom, and they did not want the Game Boy project to interfere with the Super Famicom by using up Ricoh's resources. I've seen some claims that Uemura was intentionally sabotaging R&D 1 to try and one-up them, but it's hard to say for sure whether or not that's just people exaggerating the story. The Game Boy itself ended up being a very durable device, and Okada says this was intentional. Apparently, Nintendo did not have a system in place for repairs, so they wanted to make the device as durable as possible. On that note, there's even a wild story about a Game Boy that survived and still functioned after being bombed during the Gulf War. One final development tidbit is that Okada really wanted the Game Boy to be supported by third parties, so Nintendo set up a specific position for someone to create instructions, documentation, and development tools for the system. This was a pretty stark change from how closed off the Famicom was to third parties at first. The Game Boy launched in Japan in April of 1989, and the US release was only a few months later. It didn't take long for Nintendo to realize that they had a smash hit on their hands. Other, more powerful handhelds entered the market to try and nab a piece of Nintendo's success, but none came close. While Nintendo typically presents the Game Boy sales combined with the later Game Boy Color numbers, according to Okada, the Game Boy sold 72 million units, with the Game Boy Color adding another 46 million on top. Even without the Game Boy Color, that means the Game Boy was Nintendo's best-selling console at the time. And although I personally don't know if it's entirely fair to combine the two, Nintendo's combined numbers make the Game Boy the fourth best-selling video game console to this day. Now, in this video, we're only taking a look at Super Mario Land, one of the system's 4 launch titles in Japan. However, the success of the Game Boy clearly came in part due to some of the other big titles that came later on, but I'll wait until future videos to talk more about them. As for Super Mario Land, since the Game Boy was the pet project of Nintendo R&D 1, they were largely in charge of developing the launch titles too. This meant that Super Mario Land was the first mainline Mario title where Miyamoto wasn't really involved at all. The project was instead directed by Okada himself, and perhaps due to the game being handled by a different team, it takes place in a completely different kingdom called Sarasa Land rather than the Mushroom Kingdom. Along with this new kingdom came completely different enemy types, and even a new damsel in distress, Princess Daisy. Super Mario Land ended up selling very well, amassing around 18 million units sold, which is around the same amount as Super Mario Bros. 3. At first, Nintendo of America actually considered making Super Mario Land a game that would come packaged with the Game Boy, but they ultimately went with a different game that I will cover later. Alright, with all of that history out of the way, let's jump into my time with Super Mario Land. Before getting into this too much, let's talk about color and how I've decided to play the Game Boy in this challenge. Now, as much as I can, I like to play games on original hardware, so in order to stream Game Boy footage, I had a few options: the Super Game Boy, the Game Boy Player, or a modified system to support video output. The first two options were official products, so I ruled out using a modified system right away. The Super Game Boy was a SNES cartridge that allowed you to play Game Boy games with custom color palettes on a TV, and some Game Boy games even had enhancements on the Super Game Boy. The Game Boy Player, on the other hand, was essentially a Game Boy Advance that could be attached to a GameCube, and this let you play anything a GBA could support on a TV. Since this is a Game Boy Advance, it also supports the Game Boy Color enhancements of Game Boy games. Both of these would work, but since I would need the Game Boy Player when I reached the GBA, my initial plan was to get just the Game Boy Player and only the Game Boy Player. Now, eventually, I did decide to get the Super Game Boy, well, the Super Game Boy 2 to be specific, but I decided to wait until I reached the game that launched alongside the Super Game Boy to start using it. While this does mean I missed out on being able to create custom color palettes for some of the older Game Boy games, I decided to avoid using it until later to capture the monochrome era of the Game Boy. So, just to make sure it's clear, I'm starting now with the Game Boy Player, but once I reach Donkey Kong 94, I'll be switching to the Super Game Boy. Lastly, since I decided to use the Game Boy Player, I could have used any of the Game Boy color palette options, but I just intentionally decided to go with the monochrome gray one to try and be as accurate to the original games as possible. Now, in retrospect, if I was really aiming for historical accuracy, I maybe should have chosen a green palette on the Super Game Boy to more accurately represent the green tint of the original screen, but oh well. Grayscale is what I chose, so that's what we're gonna get until I reach the launch of the Super Game Boy. Alright, back to Super Mario Land. There's no in-game story, but the manual explains that an unknown space monster named Tatonga brainwashed the people of Sarasa Land in order to conquer it, and he plans on making Princess Daisy his queen. It's up to Mario to defeat Tatonga and rescue Sarasa Land. The first world is the Birabudo Kingdom, and it's desert-themed. Immediately, we can see that they decided to make the sprites a lot smaller in general, and honestly, I'm perfectly fine with this. In fact, I prefer a zoomed-out camera over a zoomed-in one when it comes to Game Boy games. I will gladly take a hit to the visuals in order to actually be able to see what's around me. On that note, the Game Boy has a weird screen resolution. It's almost a square. This also makes it a bit trickier to have visibility with side-scrollers, and it's why my face cam is so large on the side here. Okay, I know I said this game featured a bunch of new enemies, but I guess they still had to make the first enemies Goombas and Koopas. But hey, this time the Koopas have explosive shells. Honestly, I can't help but wonder if they made this change because it was simpler than a kickable shell. Of course, the Super Mushroom power-up is back, but in this game, the Fire Flower has been replaced with the Super Ball Flower, or just Flower as it's called by the manual. This turns Mario into the rarely used Super Ball Mario, and this one allows Mario to throw diagonal projectiles that bounce off of surfaces. The first stage was pretty simple, although of course they had to add a secret pipe just like in Super Mario Bros. There's a bunch of these throughout the game, and they can sometimes have a ton of coins in them. As I made my way through level 1-1, I ran into a fly. These remind me a lot of the fighter flies from Mario Bros, although according to the Mario Wiki, Nintendo has never officially recognized the two as the same creature. Oh, the star power-up is here too, and for some reason they made the invincibility music the Can Can song. Apparently the Can Can song is officially called the Infernal Gallop, and it's from Jacques Offenbach's Orpheus in the Underworld. Instead of having a flag at the end, there's just a wall with some doors. The bottom door simply takes you to the next level, but the top one gives you a bonus stage. In this bonus, you can select a road to get a power-up, but if you pass through the ladder, you'll get a different one. You can earn a Super Ball power-up here, as well as anywhere from 1 to 3 lives. Level 2 is a bit more precarious, and it takes place on a bunch of trees. You know, it's not terrible or anything, but the physics don't feel quite as nice as Super Mario Bros. 3. I probably just need a bit more time to get used to it. I lost my first life to these floating bee enemies with spears. After some moving platforms and falling blocks at the end, level 2 went down. Level 3 is the final level of World 1, and it takes place inside a pyramid. It's got that one song that had a pretty epic remix in Smash Bros. This stage had falling blocks, piranha plants, and a fire-breathing sphinx enemy called Gao. Okay, how on earth did that miss me? At the end was the first boss, King Totemesu. Wait, if he's a king, I guess he's just the rightful ruler of this kingdom, but brainwashed by Tatanka. The guy breathed out fire sort of similar to Bowser, and I just jumped over him and hit a switch in the back. Instead of knocking down the bridge like I expected, this just caused Totemesu to randomly explode. Afterwards, I saved Daisy already. Or not, she was just a fly in disguise. Up next was World 2, the Muda Kingdom, and it's a water-themed world. Its name is sort of similar to Bermuda and the mythical Mew. For some reason, I arrived here on a UFO. Maybe I stole one of Tatanka's ships or something? The first level of World 2 had me platforming over water with a bunch of bonefish called Honin jumping out of it. Apparently, the manual says these are the skeletons of another fish enemy after they get eaten by Tatanka. Weird. This is definitely reminiscent of the jumping cheap stages in Super Mario Bros. Level 2-2 was also over the water, but there were less jumping fish this time. You know, there's quite a bit more precarious platforming in this game than I remembered. Darn, I missed a bonus this time. The final level of World 2 placed Mario in the Marine Pop, a submarine. This stage was basically a shoot-'em-up. So I got hit by the fish in this level, and then somehow this mushroom passed right through me. What the heck? Maybe I'm just paying my dues after that fireball missed me earlier. Yeah, this game definitely has some jank hitboxes. The boss of this stage was a giant seahorse named Dragon Zamasu. You could sneak underneath it to hit the switch again, but it was also pretty easy to just use the submarine to take it out. World 2 complete. Oh look, I actually rescued Daisy this time. Arg, fooled again. Let's see, we've been to the pyramids, Mew, what's next? Ah, Easter Island, of course. Well, it's officially called the Eastern Kingdom, but the inspirations are clear. This one has a bunch of Moai statues in the background, as well as some Moai-themed enemies. Oh, check out this big brain moment. Yeah, I didn't realize those were falling blocks at first. What the heck? The bullet bill cannons come out of pipes in this game? Oh, sorry, the manual says they're actually called Gira, although in later re-releases they apparently changed the name to Bullet Biff. Later in this level, I also had to ride these boulders along spike pits. Oh, come on, that boulder literally appeared out of nowhere. I got greedy for the bonus at the end and accidentally run off one of the rocks and managed to get hit by it. Well, good thing I've already got 15 lives. Level 3-2 was a cave level, and there were hazards and spiders everywhere. The platforming was getting trickier too, and I lost a couple of lives to the pits here. The falling blocks in particular were tricky. It's a bit hard to describe, but with the way the physics worked, it was super easy to just miss them or run off by mistake. Level 3-3 had a bunch of moving platforms. After a secret in one of these pipes, I almost got trolled by an invisible block. I don't even think they intended for this one to behave like a Kaizo block, but yeesh, that was close. Eventually, I entered some kind of structure and found the boss of World 3, Hiyoi-Hoi. This was another Moai head dude, and he threw those boulders from before at me. You can use these boulders he throws to reach the switch, but I just took him out with the Super Ball power-up instead. World 3 complete. Surprise, surprise, this Daisy was fake too. World 4 is the final kingdom, and it's called the Chai Kingdom. This one is simply based on China, and the first level is a bamboo forest. In this level, there's these jumping enemies called Pionpi, which are based on the undead Chinese folklore creature known as Jiangxi. So, some people say that they're the Chinese version of vampires, but a bit of a pet peeve of mine is when we try to translate monsters from other cultures into ones that are close enough to one of our own, when in reality, they're just their own thing. One quirk about them is that they travel around by leaping, which is how they move in this game too. Great, I failed another one of those falling block platforming sections again. Up next was level 4-2. Let's not talk about that first life. Anyway, this level takes place in the mountains, and I'm not sure if that's lava, water, or what down below. All I know is that from personal experience, it's deadly. There were these nasty plant guys that shot projectiles, and eventually I reached some kind of structure that had spinning fireballs sort of reminiscent of those obstacles in Super Mario Bros. 3. Man, if you stop for even a moment in the air, your momentum gets majorly slowed down. I finally died to one of those exploding Koopas here too. I made it eventually though, and up next was the final level, 4-3. This one is another shoot 'em up. This time though, I'm in the sky and Mario is piloting the Sky Pop. What the heck, are those flying chickens? And whoa, are those the sparks from Balloon Fight? There was this one part where you had to navigate through the blocks quickly, but honestly, it wasn't all that bad. At the end, I reached the boss, a cloud that shot out chickens? Huh? Where's Tatanga? This thing is apparently called Biokinton, and it's not all that menacing looking. Right after I beat it, I got wrecked by a chicken though. Oh, come on. I got it on my next try without dying to a chicken, but then Tatanga appeared. Ah, there we go. He's in this big machine, and he spammed projectiles at me. I died to him once, but honestly, his pattern is pretty easy, and I took him out on my next try. Okay, surely this is the real Daisy, right? Yep, she's real this time. She thanked Mario, and after she embraced him, the two flew off in some kind of jet. Then the credits rolled and Super Mario Land was complete. So initially I just ended the game here, but I later found out the game had a hard mode I missed. Since the game was so short, and it is a Mario game after all, I decided to come back to this one and beat hard mode. Unfortunately, to do that, I had to beat the entire game again on the regular difficulty, so I did that too. I did even better this time, ending the game with 24 lives. Okay, time for hard mode. Well, I'm not going to go over hard mode in as much detail, but unlike Super Mario Bros., instead of just making the enemies harder, they actually placed a ton of new enemies across the stages. The level that was the hardest in this playthrough was 3-2, the underground level with spiders. I lost a lot of lives to this one. The rest of the levels were pretty hectic too, but I kind of liked it as an extra challenge. It was nothing I couldn't handle, but definitely harder than the first playthrough. Beating this unlocked a level select, which I used to investigate some of the secrets I missed, like these invisible blocks here, as well as some hidden blocks with elevators and caves. Anyway, after checking these out, my time with Super Mario Land was actually complete. On to the review. Well, I often see this one ranked pretty low as far as Super Mario games go, and while I kind of get that, I still think it's a really solid launch title. The game is clearly following in the footsteps of the original Super Mario Bros., but it's definitely got its own unique style and feel. I kind of like that the game has this weird mythical setting and strange new enemies. I also in general like the overall focus on the platforming in this one. It's all about the jumping, and I appreciate that the devs were willing to make the character smaller to focus on the gameplay and level design. I enjoyed the inclusion of a hard mode too, as it added a nice level of challenge to an otherwise fairly easy game. My biggest gripes are probably with the physics. They're a clear step down from Super Mario Bros. 3, and there was definitely some jank here and there. It doesn't ruin the experience or anything though, and in some ways, mastering the different physics is rewarding in its own right. The game feels a bit short too, although I imagine back in the day it was a fun title to just pick up and do a quick playthrough of. I don't know, this may surprise some of you, but I like this one quite a bit. I think it's a super solid first attempt at a platformer on the Game Boy and just good simple fun. The physics are a bit wonky and it's a tad short, but this is one I could see myself having a fun time going back to play over and over. I gave Super Mario Land an 8 out of 10. With Super Mario Land complete, I have now finished 1 out of the 115 Game Boy games in the challenge, meaning I am now 0.86% of the way through all of the Game Boy games. Thanks for watching the video. If you want to see more of these in the future, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you won't miss out on the next one. Also leave a like if you enjoyed it, since it will help the channel grow and motivate me to continue this series. I hope I will see you in the next step of my quest to beat every Nintendo game.